Religious Interpretations of Disaster by David Chester, Angus M. Duncan, and Heather Sangster, 2012. Introduction: Archaeology and Geomythology. Clinical psychology notes that people often appeal to deities when coping with severe stress, and this is also observed amongst those who are faced with disasters associated with natural hazards. Chester and Duncan, 2009. Religious reactions to disasters are found within most traditions of faith, across societies located in different parts of the world and over the long span of human history. In some cases, it is possible to extend the timescale and interpret archaeological evidence to show how prehistoric societies used theistic frames of reference to make sense of the suffering triggered by natural events. Effigies found on the slopes of Popocatépetl volcano have been interpreted as evidence of the propitiation of divine wrath by the society that once inhabited this part of Mexico, while at Pylos in ancient Greece, there are indications that the god Poseidon, who was believed to be the cause of earthquakes, was worshipped as early as the Mycenaean era, 1600 to 1100 BCE. For archaeological sites, evidence of human reactions to disasters is usually either lacking or can be interpreted ambiguously. A wall painting, 6200 BCE, at the town of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, or Turkey, is, for instance, the oldest known example of the artistic depiction of a volcano. It shows a volcano located close to a town which could imply disquiet among the population about future eruptions, or may simply reflect the aesthetic sensibility of the artist. Chester and Duncan, 2008. In recent years, oral traditions that preserve the memories of prehistoric disasters have been extensively studied, e.g. Harris, 2000, and in some societies these myths continue to coexist alongside written records. In pre-Meiji Japan, i.e. before 1868, from prehistoric times an ensemble of beliefs and views on the earth and on nature has survived. Barbaro, 2009. While in parts of the Upper Nile, the Sudan, and East Africa, various indigenous groups continue to tell stories about the dead who reside in the underworld and are thought to be the cause of earthquakes. A note of caution needs to be sounded about oral evidence as a source of information, because when myths are translated and written down by outside observers, cultural presuppositions may influence accounts. One example occurred in 1986 during the Lake Nyos gas disaster in Cameroon, where a single word in local language covered at least two meanings in the majority of European languages. There was one word for smell and taste, and the word for red referred to all primary colors in the original language. Freeth, 1993. In addition, fully understanding the explanations of disastrous events reported by indigenous peoples may be difficult, particularly when the literate group with whom contact has been made also has recourse to theistic explanations of their own. In southern Africa in the 19th century, Enfield and Nash, 2002, have shown how the perceived heathenism of tribal peoples was thought by some Christian missionaries as being responsible for severe droughts. Tribal groups, in their turn, not only professed a number of religious myths about their environment, but also perceived the missionaries as being either responsible for drought or, conversely, as harbingers rather than withholders of rain. There is, however, overwhelming evidence that oral traditions, especially those found within pre-industrial societies, have preserved a range of theistic responses to disasters. Within the Judaic, Christian, and Islamic traditions, perhaps the best-known example is the flood myth that, although recorded in the Book of Genesis in the Christian Old Testament and Hebrew Bible, represents a much older oral and written tradition which was present across ancient Mesopotamia and was later recorded by the Greeks. In Europe and North America, doubts over the veracity of the biblical flood were still part of scholarly discourse until the 19th century. Dundas, 1988, has shown how flood myths occur throughout the world, and as well as in the ancient Near East, are also to be found in Mesoamerica, South America, Asia, and Africa. In Germany, North Sea floods in 1570, 1634, and 1717 were similarly ascribed to God, using a variety of theological explanations, Mulshagen, 2009, while during pre-industrial times in Finland, summer frosts were assumed to be due to God's punishment of sinners. Medieval Arabic texts contain reference to pre-Islamic beliefs concerning theistic responsibility for plagues as well as earthquakes. Many verses from the early part of the Quranic revelation continued to ascribe these phenomena to God, Akasoy 2009, and indeed a similar model of divine punishment was frequently invoked to explain plagues in Christian Europe during medieval times, Smoller 2000. As far as droughts were concerned, not only was God's responsibility undoubted within the Hebrew Bible, for example 2 Chronicles 7:13-14, but it was still invoked in the 1970s to explain a lack of rain in northwestern Nigeria by Christians and Muslims alike, Dupree and Roeder, 1974. Today, the study of myths about disasters is a major academic field, and a full review is beyond the scope of this article, but a flavor of the range of responses may be gleaned from the following table, which uses volcanic eruptions as an example, and shows how human reactions transcend place, time, and culture. Examples of pre-industrial societies in which volcanic eruptions have been interpreted theistically. Southern Europe. During the classical period, the Etruscan god Vulcan was thought to be a destructive agent, but was sometimes viewed as a god of productive fire. Hephaestus, or Vulcan, was normally viewed as a constructive craftsman, but volcanoes were also personified as the destructive god Titan. On Etna, Lucilius Jr., 1st century CE, recorded that the people offered incense to appease the gods who were thought to control the mountain. In classical literature, Thera, Santorini, is frequently mentioned and may have been the setting for Plato's Atlantis, which was created by Poseidon. Northern Europe. In Icelandic mythology, the god Surtur was the incarnation of eruptions. Africa. Before European contact, tribal groups located in the vicinity of Nyamurigara and Nyiragongo volcanoes in Central Africa annually sacrificed 10 of their warriors. In Ethiopia, some older inhabitants still lay offerings to the serpent god Arwe. The serpent god was a god of terror who could be propitiated by the annual sacrifice of maidens. The god was killed around 1000 BCE, but worship is still evident in some remote areas. Central Mongolia. In the Mongolian language, the name of the little-known Ha-Togu volcano means black pot. There is a local belief that a dragon lives in the volcano. Indonesia. Until recently in Java, human sacrifice to appease Bromo volcano was practiced. Chickens are now substituted. In central Java, the residents have their own perceptions about the dangers of Mount Merapi. They believe in spirits, and these provide the residents with a subjective sense of security. Japan. The Oni monster is a horned red giant, whose effigy is still to be found in souvenir shops. In Japan, many volcanic features are called jigoku. Jigoku is a term for hell, introduced into Japan from Buddhism, with its notions of an underground prison. Archaeological sites in southern Kyushu show evidence of spiritual activity. There is an example of a pot being offered to propitiate disaster during the accumulation of ash around 1300 BP. Hawaii. There are many legends about the need to propitiate the goddess Pele, who was thought to control human fate. Offerings of fruit, bananas, pork, and tobacco are traditional. Vanuatu and Fiji. Volcano-initiated disasters are sometimes described in myths and legends in Vanuatu, and are usually attributed to demons or spirits who wish to punish a breach of a social or cultural taboo. In oral history, many eruptions were initiated by a sorcerer using a ritual song or incantation. Should ritual rules be broken, then eruption could punish the people. Until recently, animal sacrifice was important. In Fiji, there are legends about the two gods, Tanovo, who presided over Ono Island, and Tataumalo, who ruled southwestern Kadalvu. New Zealand. In the period before European settlement, each group within Maori society possessed its own sacred mountain. Te Huebau, chief of the Ngate Tuhuwatoa tribe in the Taupo district, told an Austrian geologist in 1859 that volcanic fire was sent from the mythical Maori homeland in response to a call from Ngāto Torangi, the high priest. North America. Harris 2000 has proposed that Native Americans may have preserved memories of the Mount Mazama eruption in Oregon in 7500 BP. The Klamath tribe believed that this large eruption was a battle between the Mazama god, Lau, and Skell, the sky god. Basaltic lava flows dating from the mid-11th century from Sunset Crater in northern Arizona show corncasts on the surface, which have been interpreted as representing ritual practices of divine appeasement. Devil's Tower may also be interpreted deistically. Propitiatory Central and South America. Propitiatory human sacrifices were a feature of Maya, Aztec, and Inca responses to volcanic activity. In Nicaragua, it was held that Coseguina volcano would not erupt if a child was sacrificed every 25 years. Virginal sacrifice was also a feature of the society who lived on the flanks of Masaya. In the years before the Spanish conquest, people living in the vicinity of Huaynaputina volcano in Peru sacrificed sheep, birds, and personal clothing to the volcano, with some people even claiming that they conversed directly with the demons who supposedly controlled the mountain. Disasters and the major religions of the world. Religious interpretations of disasters are still to be found across all the major religions of the world. Within Judaism and Christianity, attempts to reconcile the concept of an omniscient and loving God with the simultaneous existence of evil and suffering in the world is termed theodicy, from the Greek theos for God and dike for justice, the word first being coined by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in 1710. Attempts to understand the reasons why people suffer have exercised the minds of philosophers and theologians for thousands of years, being notable features not only of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian New Testament, and Christian theology, but also the sacred texts and theologies of other major world religions. In Judaism and Christianity, until recently, two models of theodicy have been prominent: the free will, Augustinian, and the best possible worlds, Iranian. The former emphasizes that human beings have freedom, and that suffering is not only a result of the operation of free will, but may also involve sinfulness, because a person has acted against God's purpose. Divine punishment is sometimes stressed, being the predominant feature of most disasters recorded in Scripture, and many that have been taken place subsequently. For example, in Iceland in the Middle Ages, the fearsome noises that issued from some volcanoes were thought to be the screams of tormented souls in the fires of hell below. Sigurdsson, 1999. In England in the 1380s pestilence, declining fortunes in war, and finally an earthquake in 1382, caused many people to assume that these presaged a final divine reckoning. And in continental Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, disasters, especially earthquakes, floods, and hailstones, were thought to be increasing in frequency, and were held to foreshadow an imminent apocalypse. Although much reduced as an explanation of human suffering, especially since the 18th century European Enlightenment, divine retribution is still an explanation used by some evangelical Christian groups, and was held by a small minority following the Indian Ocean tsunami disaster of 2004 the British floods of 2007, the Australian drought of the first decade of the 21st century, and the Haitian earthquake of 2010. Following the La Josefina landslide in Ecuador in 1993, some farmers still adopted either a Christian notion of divine wrath or one based on a syncretic understanding of the relationships between Christian and earlier animistic beliefs. Morris, 2003. A best of all possible worlds theodicy holds that it would probably be impossible to design any system of nature which did not have the potential to injure unsuspecting humans. Murphy, 2005. And that God's purpose is to use disasters to enable a greater good to be achieved. Without earthquakes, for instance, there would be no global tectonics, and without volcanic eruptions, no planetary atmospheres. And within the literature, there are many instances where a best of all possible worlds theodicy has been used. London was struck by two small earthquakes on the 8th of February and 8th of March in 1750, and although many clergy preached of divine wrath inflicted on the people of Britain, some adopted a best of all possible worlds theodicy, a reaction that was also evident following earthquakes in Venice in 1873 and Colchester, England in 1884. Both the free will involving divine retribution and the best of all possible worlds theodicy were also evident in the aftermath of the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The word Islam means submission to the will of God, and in the Quran, hadith, oral traditions relating to the actions of Muhammad, and many statements of Muslim theology, suffering is perceived as a punishment for sin, as instrumental to the purposes of God, and as a severe test of faith. Bowker, 1970. In the Quran, earthquakes are interpreted within two different yet related frameworks and are viewed either as signs of a future apocalypse or as a punishment of a limited duration for a specific group of people. Akasoi, 2009. Disasters, more generally, either express God's anger at human actions or act instrumentally as warnings of future punishments of sinfulness and or the eventual day of judgment. Akasoi, 2009. Although statements of Islamic theology regarding disasters are more heterogeneous than may be assumed from this summary, many historic disasters have been interpreted by those affected in this traditional Islamic manner. For instance, the 16th century polymath Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti emphasized moral explanations of all manner of disasters, including judgments for adultery and drinking wine. The 1576 Cairo earthquake was widely understood to be a reproof for the popularity of coffee houses in the city. The Krakatoa eruption in 1883 was interpreted as punishment for sins, including the acceptance of colonial rule imposed by the Dutch. And in writing of drought in Yelwa, northern Nigeria, Dupree and Roeder, 1974, report that most of the people who were affected thought it was blasphemous to speculate on future droughts because human fate is in the hands of Allah. More recently, the eminent physicist Pervez Hoodbloy, 2007, has discussed the impact on an Islamic society of the earthquake that struck Pakistan in 2005 and killed approximately 90,000 people. In Pakistan, no prominent scientist challenged the idea of divine punishment, while some mullahs encouraged their followers to sell their television sets, which were thought to have provoked Allah's anger, and many of Hoodboy's students accepted an explanation based on divine wrath. In Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, and Shinto, there is a common belief that a person's behavior leads to an appropriate reward or punishment, and this has often encouraged fatalistic attitudes towards disasters. Karma means that current actions are the seeds of future happiness or suffering, and there is no notion of innocent suffering. In Buddhism, reincarnation is emphasized. Sins committed in former lives are important, and happiness, together with suffering, are both deserved. In Buddhism and Jainism, there is no belief in a creator God, and hence the issue of theodicy is far less acute than in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. In Buddhism, the notion of anicca, impermanence, is a central element of faith, and following the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, many survivors, including the bereaved, perceived the event as yet another, if dramatic, example of Anika. De Silva, 2006. Interviews undertaken amongst survivors in Sri Lanka indicated a correlation between belief in karma and a pessimistic explanatory style on one hand, and on the other, poor health and the occurrence of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, some 6 months after the disaster struck. Levy et al., 2009. In early Vedic Hindu texts, the gods are powerful and can be appealed to, but in later Hindu thinking, karma becomes more prominent, and even the gods are subordinate to it, with suffering being embedded into the spiritual structure of the world. Interviews carried out following the Indian Ocean tsunami concluded that many Hindus accepted disaster as part of a cycle of creation and destruction, which had to be passively, even fatalistically, accepted. Shinto is a syncretic religion showing features similar to Buddhism, together with some unique features. Shinto means the way of the kami, which is the way of the gods, or spirits. The kami are the mystical figures and forces of the natural world. Ancestors have a special role to play in the common memory of the Japanese people, and following some decades in a cemetery, the ancestral spirits become helpful kami. The notion that kami reside in shrines, and in some cases are permanently present within them, is a feature of Shinto, and shrine worship of mountains, including volcanoes such as Fuji, is strongly developed in Japan. Chester and Duncan, 2008. Sometimes responses to disasters are syncretic, and simultaneously show elements reflecting the theologies of different religions. For example, in their study of the Merapi volcano, Levine et al. 2008 discuss how reactions to eruptions are complex, showing the influence not only of Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism, but also spirit cults, ancestor worship, spirit healing, and shamanism. Examples of syncretism are discussed by Chester and Duncan, 2008. Academic interpretations of religious responses to disasters. Academic scholarship has been highly critical of the influence of religion on the human understanding of disasters. According to this reading of intellectual history, the period from the rise of Christianity as the official faith of the Roman Empire until the 17th and 18th centuries is interpreted as a long, dark age, in which superstition largely replaced the naturalistic explanations of disaster that were embryonic in the classical era. Sigurdsson, 1999, Chester and Duncan, 2009. It is further maintained that following the 18th century Enlightenment, religious explanations became less prominent and were progressively replaced by more scientific and social scientific explanations of disasters. The notion of the act of God was superseded by a perspective in which natural catastrophes represented interactions between vulnerable populations and a demoralized natural world. This change first began in Europe and North America, and later spread to other parts of the Christianized world, and has more recently influenced disaster responses in countries where other religious traditions predominate. According to the hazard analyst David Alexander, the repetitiveness of impacts and forms of damage, the deliberate or inadvertent creation of vulnerability, and the gross predictability of the consequences of disasters all add up to human, not supernatural, responsibility. While for Dennis Dean, a historian of geology, theorizing independent of the Bible began in America with the Enlightenment. It was the mid-19th century the disaster that geology represented to religious orthodoxy was apparent, and although there were attempts at reconciliation, the mechanistic view quickly became dominant. Dean, 1979. It is maintained by the academic consensus that where religious interpretations are still to be found, these places represent last redoubts of backwardness and superstition. In order to test the veracity of this account of intellectual history, we have compiled two archives. The first lists major volcanic eruptions that occurred throughout the world between 1850 and 2002, and of the 49 events recorded, only 16, about 33%, show no evidence of interpretations being cast in religious terms. Chester and Duncan, 2008. The second archive was compiled to record religious reactions to major earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that occurred between 1900 and 2008 in countries with a predominantly Christian ethos. Chester and Duncan, 2009. Of the 61 discrete events, about 72% show evidence of people responding using religious frames of reference, a figure that would probably be even higher if local records can be consulted in more detail. For instance, records of the 1902 and 1929 Guatemalan earthquakes show no evidence of religious responses, yet more detailed reports following the 1976 disaster show that religious explanations were both deep-seated and of long duration within Guatemalan society. The archives indicate that religious responses are not just confined to societies untouched by modernism, and during the 2001 eruption of Mount Etna in Sicily, for example, the Archbishop of Catania celebrated Mass in the village of Belpasso in order to enlist God's help in protecting their homes and livelihoods against the lava flow that was threatening the village. The Mass took place in a well-educated society, involved community leaders, and high levels of participation indicate that religious responses are still widespread across the Etna region. Evidence from recent disasters confirms that religious interpretations are still important across a range of faith traditions. Losses in the 2003 Bam earthquake in Iran were widely interpreted in Islamic terms, whilst following the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, Buddhists in Sri Lanka tried to make sense of disaster losses using a religious frame of reference to their particular faith. Changing attitudes. In recent decades, there has been a major transformation, indeed a paradigm shift, in the ways in which hazard analysts have studied natural hazards, and this new perspective has been paralleled by a similar paradigm shift in Christian theodicy. See Chester and Duncan, 2009. Until the mid-1980s, hazard analysts used a methodology known as the dominant approach, in which extreme natural events, rather than vulnerable human populations, were held to be the principal causes of disaster. This approach was accepted implicitly by the small number of Christian theologians who addressed the suffering caused by natural extremes, because it could be used to support a best of all possible worlds model of theodicy, e.g. Farrer, 1966. Two quotations from Austin Farrer illustrate how the two strands of argument, one from theology and the other from science, are woven together. If an earthquake shakes down a city, an urgent practical problem arises: how to rescue, feed, house, and console the survivors, rehabilitate the injured, and commend the dead to the mercy of God. Less immediately, how to reconstruct in a way which will minimize the effects of another disaster. But no theological problem arises. The will of God expressed in this event is His will for the physical elements in the Earth's crust or under it, His will that they should go on being themselves and act in accordance with their natures. Farrer, 1966. It is not then that the humanly inconvenient byproducts of volcanic fire are cushioned or diverted. It is not that all harms to man are prevented. It is that the creative work of God never ceases, that there is always something His providence does, even for the most tragically stricken. Farrer, 1966. More recently, many theologians have found Leibnizian models of theodicy increasingly unconvincing, arguing that they are a means of focusing evil and suffering on God and absolving humankind from any responsibility. John Wesley, founder of Methodism, interpreted the 1755 Lisbon earthquake as a divine punishment for the sins of the Inquisition, and the notion that human sinfulness resides at the heart of disasters is a more important insight than was realized at the time. When sectarianism is removed from Wesley's remarks, then they are close to what many contemporary Christian theodicists and hazard analysts are proposing. For hazard analysts, disasters are increasingly viewed as outcomes of vulnerability for which human beings are largely responsible, because vulnerability often occurs as a result of global, regional, and local disparities in wealth, poverty, and power. More than 99% of volcano-related deaths in the 20th century occurred in countries that may be classed as economically less developed. From the perspective of theodicy, what is sometimes called the liberationist approach argues that it is structural rather than individual human sinfulness, which is reflected in disaster losses, because these two are reflective of differences in poverty, wealth, and power, which occur both within and between countries. Structural sinfulness was first identified by Latin American liberation theologians of the 1970s and 1980s, such as Clodovis Boff, Leonardo Boff, and Gustavo Gutierrez, where it was viewed as a process that kept the poor and disadvantaged in a state of subjection. Starting with the 1970 earthquake in Peru, there has been intense reflection on earthquake losses, especially by theologian John Sobrino, 2004. Box 10.1 Disaster Risk Reduction at the Parliament of the World's Religions. Andreana Reel, RMIT University, Australia. The 2009 Parliament of the World's Religions in Melbourne was an event bringing together hundreds of faith practitioners. During one forum, entitled Faith, Community, and Disaster Risk Reduction, various speakers converged to discuss the role of religion in disaster risk reduction, DDR. A Western paradigm encourages us to set humans against nature. Natural events like floods and fires are seen as hazards that humans must contend with and conquer. In the ancient spiritualities of many indigenous traditions, humanity is understood to be inextricably linked to nature. One forum participant, Len Clark, an indigenous Australian leader and educator, pointed out to participants that it is impossible to divorce people from environment. When humans do not respect Mother Nature lets us know, with increased fires, floods, and other disasters. This theme was picked up by Deborah Story of TIER Australia, a Christian development advocacy and relief organisation. She contended that many of the world's disasters are caused by overconsumption of the wealthy. This level of consumption has a knock-on effect throughout the world's economies, which eventually results in more floods, more cyclones, and more droughts. This is felt disproportionately by the world's poor, and forces more people to live in disaster-prone areas. Deborah pointed to Christian scripture, exhorting people to consume sustainably. The religious worldview does not always encourage people to see disasters in this way. Hafiz Aziz Rahman, assistant professor at the Faculty of Sharia and Law, International Islamic University in Islamabad, explained that in the aftermath of the 2005 Pakistan Kashmir earthquake, many Islamic leaders interpreted the disaster as divine retribution. This kind of thinking, said Rahman, does not help society to address the root causes of disaster. Fundamentalist Christians also attributed the destruction of New Orleans by Hurricane Katrina to divine displeasure with a sinful city. Many Islamic non-governmental organizations, NGOs, came to the aid of Pakistan's earthquake victims, as well as volunteers from across the faith community. Without the religious component, the disaster response would have been much slower. Reverend Chi Kwang Sunim, a Buddhist nun, meditation teacher and survivor of the 2009 bushfires in Victoria, Australia, explained how churches and Buddhist groups worked together to provide relief for bushfire victims. She also organized a Buddhist service to help survivors cope with the aftermath, and continues to use her position as a community leader to sit on committees to help her community recover. Ruth Maytala, a researcher, community leader, and government official of the Solomon Islands, emphasized the importance of engaging with religious leaders in any kind of DRR strategy. In the Solomon Islands, 98% of the population belongs to a Christian church, and church leaders hold more clout than any other kind of authority. Reflecting on this forum, one can see how important it is to consider the religious angle in DRR. As Rebecca Monson, an Australian National University PhD candidate, pointed out, religion sits alongside other factors to determine a community's overall vulnerability. Religion plays a role in disaster worldview, preparedness, response, and rebuilding. Box 10.2. The Position and Role of Faith-Based Organization in DRR. Bruno de Cordier, Conflict Research Group, Ghent University in Belgium. The importance of faith-based organizations, FBOs, in risk reduction and disaster response has long been underestimated. At first glance, when needs are the most acute in the aftermath of a disaster, it does not matter much for those affected whether aid efforts come from faith-based or secular actors. In terms of preparedness and coping with the impact of disasters, however, identity and culture, including religion and faith-based actors, do matter. Many contexts in the global periphery, highly vulnerable to natural hazards, are societies where religion and faith-based actors are much more present and important than they are in strongly secularized Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, countries. Often, Christian, Islamic, and other local FBOs and their volunteer networks provide a number of social services where the state is absent or is contracted in the social field. Although their values, discourse, and modus operandi are often not those promoted by the international aid sector, they are often much more anchored in and representative of the context's real social tissue than the urban elite groups who are well represented in the international aid sector and often determine the latter's priorities and partnerships. It is in that capacity of local social institutions that FBOs have a role and added value. Their long-term presence in the context, their volunteer networks, and the social infrastructure like schools, clinics, and welfare centers that religious organizations run form a solid local framework for rapid and effective aid efforts. In the Pakistani sector of Jammu Kashmir, for example, long-present Islamic charities like the Al-Mustafa Welfare Society and the Al-Khidmat Foundation were bringing aid to the displaced and the earthquake victims in 2005. In the Indonesian province of Aceh, volunteers of the Islamic group Persyariakatan Muhammadiyah also carried out aid work immediately after the tsunami of 2004. These efforts have often been overlooked or even consciously minimized once large-scale international aid and the global media arrived. Another role for the FBOs in DRR is to stress people's responsibility to mitigate hazards before they happen, for example through land planning and relief preparedness measures. Religious infrastructure like churches and mosques can also serve as shelters and distribution points, a purpose they actually served in a number of emergencies. In emergency situations with refugees and internally displaced, religious actors and FBOs can, besides the delivery of practical and technical aid, facilitate the observation of religious festivals and duties among those who face difficulties in observing religious obligations because they have been uprooted from their usual environment or because they lack the resources. Second, there is what Jean-François Meyer calls infuse tragedy with meaning among communities and populations where there is a cultural reflex to make sense of a disaster or displacement or to find solace for psychological distress through religion. On the other hand, FBOs can also have a negative impact when they distribute relief goods to their confessional following only, and as such, create or exacerbate conflict. End boxes. With regard to other world religions, similar paradigm shifts have not taken place, but there are many signs that these other faiths are becoming theologically more diverse in their approaches to disasters, and more accepting of measures to reduce hazard exposure. Islam has experienced stretching back more than 1,000 years of accommodating different political and social conditions across the world, and this is manifested in a great diversity of practice. One example of theological accommodation may be seen following the 1992 Dashur earthquake in Egypt, when the government produced a report entitled Earthquake Catastrophes and the Role of People in Facing Them, which successfully reconciled scientific, planning, and Islamic perspectives on disaster losses, Deg and Homan, 2005. Such an approach promises much for other Muslim countries where Islamic believers and Enlightenment-inspired earth and social scientists have often viewed disaster with mutual incredulity. A further development over recent decades has been the growth in Islamic humanitarian agencies, which provide relief aid to people affected by disasters, within contexts fully in accord with Islamic theology and faithful observance. Writing of the UK-based organizations Islamic Relief Worldwide and Muslim Aid, which provide aid following disasters, argues that both charities find their justification in zakat, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and one which involves those with an income above a certain level making compulsory donations each year to the needy. Today, in the UK and other economically more developed countries, voluntary charitable donations, or sadaqah, are usually made in cash, being frequently sent to Muslim countries that are suffering from the effects of disasters. In Iran, following the 2003 earthquake, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, emphasized that the disaster represented God's testing of the population rather than divine punishment of individual sinners. In the aftermath of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Sri Lanka, De Silva 2006 suggests that the more optimistic teachers of Buddhism, including virya, energy and vigor, and karuna, compassion, may be employed in both counseling disaster-affected people and justifying active involvement in relief. In Sri Lanka, numerous Buddhist monks also provided immediate help and support. In reviewing the Indian Gujarat earthquake of 2001, a survey of survivors found that those who helped others during the relief phase of the emergency often did so as a means of improving their karma. Conclusions. Although there are a small number of examples where people have resisted relief efforts due to their religious faith, these are exceptions, and for the most part, belief neither inhibits more practical measures being taken to reduce individual or group exposure to hazards, nor does it hinder people accepting help from civil authorities. Believing at the same time in two mutually incompatible worldviews, or holding one opinion and acting contrary to it, is known in the literature as parallel practice, or more ambiguously as cognitive dissonance. Chester and Duncan, 2009. This has been discussed in detail with reference to countries with a predominantly Christian ethos, though it appears across the spectrum of world faiths. And this, combined with new perspectives that focus on helping disaster-affected people rather than blaming the disaster on sinfulness, means that religious institutions and their leaders have the potential to become valuable resources in disaster reduction and mitigation. All over the world, faith communities are already active in response to disasters and recovery activities, and these activities could increase. Wisner, 2010. Religious leaders, for instance, often know where people reside, can identify the missing and survivors, may provide psychological support and pastoral care, and not least act as community leaders and spokespersons. The world's major religions also have access to financial resources, may be established providers of education and medical care, and are valuable assets in the process of recovery, as well as in prevention and risk reduction.